Amen. We should be seated. I hope you have a Bible with you, but if you don't, there are some red ones underneath the seat in front of you. I say this just about every week. We want you to have God's Word in your hand, certainly over the next few minutes, but also just in your life. And so if you don't own a Bible, we would love for you to take that Bible. Let it be our gift to you. If you're using one of those Bibles, you're new to the Bible, you don't know where 1 Samuel is, and you find your way to page 236 and 237, you'll be right where we need to be. Brian Wilson asked me a question about 5 minutes before this service started. He said, "What is it that you're wanting them to do?" Which is an awesome question that I really should have considered before 5 minutes before this service started, you know? But at the time, I didn't have a great answer, and I hope I do now. What I should have said to Brian then, and I want to say to you, and to some degree this is true every single Sunday, what I want you to do is I want you to leave this place knowing how glorious God is. I want you to live a life that matches that. As is often the case with the Old Testament, when we walk through Old Testament stories, we're going to see more of a negative example. And what I want you to see from that negative example is instead a positive motivation for what it means about how your life should be shaped by the glory of God. The Hebrew word that is translated here in our text to speak of glory, the idea behind it is an idea of weight. That God is weighty. He's massive. Many of you will know that my niece, Audrey, and her fiance, Cameron, were married over the weekend, and my wife is a woman far too beautiful for anyone that should be married to me. But I think this is true across the board, and if I'm wrong, I'm wrong. But for 2 days and 1 night, there was an awful lot of luggage. And I was trying to take all of the luggage along with fake flowers and candlesticks and all the things, and I was trying to fit them. She had said to me, "Please put them in my car." They barely fit in my truck, right? But even with that, I'm taking them. And, you know, if I didn't put the weightiest thing in first, I never would have gotten it all in. And so that's my hope for you this morning, is that when we talk about the glory of God, you would see, number one, just how weighty God is. Because that has so many implications for the burdens that you carry, for the fears that you have, the things that you're anxious about. It speaks so much to so many things of that. But if you don't put that in first, then you're going to get so much of it wrong. A number of years ago, and I think I may have used this story once before, but a number of years ago, we were digging out an old flower bed that sits right in front of my house. And as I was digging out that flower bed, that was mostly weeds at this point, I came upon a small statue of a man in a robe. And I inquired of others what that was, and they told me, "Oh, that's a saint, and they bury them in the ground because it helps good things to grow." And all I have to say is, if that's true, it didn't work, okay? None of it worked. And this morning, I just wonder if you can identify in some ways, in much more significant ways, if there was an opportunity in front of you, whether it was a job possibility or a college you really wanted to go to, or a relationship that you really set your heart on, whether it was a friendship or a romantic relationship, and you prayed for that, and you asked other people to pray for it, and you set out in front of God, "Here are all the reasons, God, why this is a good thing for me." And then it didn't happen. And you thought to yourself, "That's not right. It's not supposed to work that way." Now, our text this morning, usually what we do if you're here for your first time, usually we'll read the text at this point and we'll walk our way through it. And we are going to be walking through it. But I've got 3 chapters for you this morning and not a lot of time. So we're not going to read through the text. We are going to focus in on a few verses as we go. But you're going to hear me summarizing more than I typically do. So we're going to be looking at chapter 4, verse 1, all the way through chapter 7, verse 1. So just over 3 chapters this morning in just a small amount of time. And so hopefully you've got that in front of you and you'll be able to follow along, and maybe sometime today, before you forget everything that I've said this morning, you can sit down and you can read through the text and you can find out whether or not I'm just making things up or not. The Philistines are the focus of our text. And I said to you a few weeks ago when we started this book that the Philistines are one of the primary enemies of Israel at this time. The Philistines, this more advanced people that had come into this region that, if you're not a Jewish person, you refer often to this region as Palestine because it's derived directly from the word Philistine. And yet these people were outsiders. They had invaded. They were a more advanced people that had arrived by the sea. And they built these 5 city-states that were there, and we're going to read about them in chapter 6, verse 17. Those 5 city-states will be named out. But chapter 4 begins with a story, and we don't know why there was a battle. We don't know who picked the fight, but there was a battle between Israel and the Philistines, and it did not go well for Israel. It says they lost 4,000 men. 4,000, and we don't know how many more were casualties, but that's a significant loss in that time. And we see in verse 3 of chapter 4, look at it with me, the Israelites are going to ask the right question. Because it says in verse 3, when the troops returned to the camp, the elders of Israel ask, why did the Lord defeat us today before the Philistines? What a weird question to ask if they don't believe that God is all-powerful. But they ask the right question. They asked the right question because they knew that ultimately it wasn't the Philistines or their God that had defeated them. It was because God didn't go with them. And they asked the question, but one of the things we're going to see is that when they ask the questions, they don't wait or think long enough for the right answer to the question. They just act in response. I find myself like that a lot. We ask the right question and don't wait for the answer. And we're going to get to what they did in response in just a moment. But first, I'm going to spoil it for you, like every bad storyteller does, all right? And I'm going to let you know it doesn't work. In fact, instead of 4,000 dead in the second battle, there's 30,000 dead. Significant losses that we're looking at here. We see that in chapter 4, verse 10. And to top it all off, the Ark of the Covenant is captured. Now, for those of you that might be new to the Old Testament, the Ark of the Covenant is this box that's a repository. It's two things, but number one, it's a repository for all the different elements of the Old Testament covenant. You've got the 10 Commandment tablets in there. You've got some of the manna from the wildernesses in there, and they carried this box around. But it was also, number two, it was considered to be the footstool, the earthly footstool of the heavenly throne of God. So it was the representation of the presence of God among his people and the power of God. It was a representation of God among his people, and that ark was captured and it was taken to the Philistines. This is probably, if you were to read the story of the Old Testament, this is probably the second darkest time for the Hebrew people. Because as far as they were concerned, we're going to see that their God was now captive by a foreign people. Now, word gets brought back to Eli, and we see that he's old and blind and obese. And this person runs to him and he says, I need you to tell me what happened. And he tells him two things. He tells him, number one, that his two sons are dead, which doesn't seem to really unsettle him much at all because he'd already been told this was going to happen twice. But the next thing that he's told is that the ark is captured. And when he hears this, he's so startled by it that he falls backwards in his chair, breaks his neck, and dies. And at this moment, not only is their God, as far as they think, not only is their God captured, but now they have no judge to rule over them. They have no high priest to represent them before the Lord. So it's an understatement to say that things are going badly. At which point, all of these things happen. If you think it can't get worse, this is like Old Testament Jerry Springer. It always gets worse, okay? It always gets worse. Somebody likes Jerry Springer out there. They were upset by that. Because Eli's now recently widowed daughter-in-law is pregnant. And she goes into labor at the news of all of this. And it doesn't go well. And as often happened for women in ancient times, she is dying. And she takes this baby and she names this baby Ichabod, because the Hebrew word for glory is kabod. So Ichabod, it can mean no glory if it's a statement, or if it's a question, it can mean where is the glory? Like, where did it go? And so she names her child that because she says the glory of God has departed. Look at verses 21 and 22. She named the boy Ichabod, saying, the glory has departed from Israel. Sorry, I should have said which chapter. Chapter 4. 21 and 22. The glory has departed from Israel, referring to the capture of the ark of God and to the deaths of her father-in-law and her husband. The glory has departed from Israel, she said, because the ark of God has been captured. Once again in this book, we see a woman with far better theology than the supposed spiritual heads of the people. And she's partly right and she's partly wrong, because God's glory had departed, but it had departed long before the ark had been captured. And what I want you to see this morning is this. I want you to understand from these chapters, I want you to understand that God's power and God's presence can never be separated from God's glory. God's power and God's presence can never be separated from God's glory. My extended family is all from Arkansas. And so I say that as a precursor so you can get the right picture in your mind here for a moment. But one of my favorite uncles was, when I say he was an incredible man, I mean that in the most literal way of the word. It seems unbelievable. Because this man, he could hunt, he could fish, he could build just about anything. He had a shop with so many tools and large pieces of equipment that I couldn't even imagine all the things that he did. And so many ways I looked up to him. And he could tell a story like nobody could tell a story. One of the funniest people alive as far as I'm concerned. But this man never wore anything except overalls. He had his Sunday overalls and his work overalls. That's what he wore all the time. He had this long beard. And I remember years ago, I saw him for the first time in a long time without his beard. And I asked him, I said, what happened to the beard? And he rubbed his chin and he says, well, got bugs. And I laughed because I thought he was kidding, but he wasn't. And my point is this, he's an incredible person to spend time around. I love being around him so much. You might not want to take him to like a 5-star restaurant or even like a 3-star restaurant. I mean, you probably, but when you take him, you have to take all of him. And my point in that story is to say the same thing is true about God. When you take God, you have to take all of him. We cannot separate out God's presence or his power from his glory. And what we're going to see is that the Hebrew people often did exactly that. A lot of people want certain aspects of God, but not others. A lot of people want God to be a lucky charm. They want God to be a powerful God that can do things for them, but not near enough to actually require things of us. Or they want a God who is relatable and personal and all of those kinds of things, but not a God who's so powerful or glorious that he could actually make demands on our life. And what we're going to see in these chapters is that we cannot take God. Those kinds of people, they want his presence without his glory. They think of God as just a wealthy, doddering, lovable old uncle that we can get to do what we want him to do. But God cannot be reduced down. God's power and God's presence can never be separated from God's glory. So I told you there's going to be a bit of a negative example to propel us forward to positive living, okay? But the first thing that I want you to see, that because that is true, three things that can never happen because of the glory of God. And the first thing that I want you to see is that God can never be manipulated. God can never be manipulated. I want you to look at verses 3 through 8 of chapter 4. It says, when the troops returned to the camp, the elders of Israel asked, why did the Lord defeat us today before the Philistines? Let's bring the ark of the Lord's covenant from Shiloh. Then it will go with us and save us from our enemies. Now, what's going on in their mind is almost certainly that not that far in their past history, they could think of the story of Joshua when he was leading his men out to conquer Jericho, and God had directed him to march around the city, and God himself was going to tear down the walls of that city. And when Joshua does that, he brings the Ark of the Covenant. So probably they're thinking of something like that. We can bring God along with us. So verse 4, it says, so the people sent men to Shiloh to bring back the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord of armies, who is enthroned between the cherubim. Eli's two sons, Hophni and Phinehas, were there with the Ark of the Covenant of God. And when the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord entered the camp, all the Israelites raised such a loud shout that the ground shook. That sounds good, right? That sounds good. Verse 6, the Philistines heard the sound of the war cry and asked, what's this loud shout in the Hebrews' camp? And when the Philistines discovered that the ark of the Lord had entered the camp, they panicked. A god has entered their camp, they said. Woe to us! Nothing like this has happened before. Woe to us! Who will rescue us from these magnificent gods? These are the gods that slaughtered the Egyptians with all kinds of plagues in the wilderness. Now, if I can just read one more verse, it says, show some courage and be men, Philistines. Otherwise, you'll serve the Hebrews just as they served you. Now be men and fight. They're probably thinking of Joshua, but the way that they're using the ark is they're using it like a talisman. We take God with us. In fact, verse 3, it says in our translation, then it, the ark, will go with us and save us from our enemies. And most translations have it that way. And it's probably accurate, but it can also be translated, then he will go with us. And either way you translate it, the point is exactly the same. They think that by taking the ark with them, that they are requiring God to come this time. We lost last time, the 3,000 men, because God didn't go with us. But if we take the ark, then God has no choice. If we take the ark, then God knows that if he gets defeated, then everybody's going to think that Dagon, the god of the Philistines, defeated Yahweh, the God of the Hebrews. And God's not going to let that happen. They're trying to manipulate God. It's like when you're in a situation and somebody comes up to you and they start off by saying something like, I know how kind and gracious you are. I know how generous you are. So could you please just help me out with this thing? At which point you really just have the option of saying, I'm really not that generous. You misjudged me. I'm not really that way at all. But no, it's manipulative. And there are some places that call themselves churches and some people that call themselves pastors that would teach you to manipulate God. They tell you to tell God what you want and to keep demanding it until he is forced to give it to you. That's the reason that pastors of such churches drive expensive cars and live in expensive homes, because they need it to support that theology. I wonder if there are certain things that you want and you are treating God that way. You think of God as a genie in the bottle. And you're going to take it out and you're going to rub and you're going to rub and you're going to rub, and eventually God is going to give you the 3 wishes that you hope for. But I want you to understand first, God is never manipulated. They think they can control him in this way, but as I already spoiled, they get defeated even worse. Because God is not concerned with what the world thinks of him. He's God. He's not insecure for the thoughts and opinions of others. God is never manipulated. Number 2, I want you to see this. God is never defeated. God is never defeated. Israel saw their 2 defeats as God's defeat, especially the second one. The Philistines would have seen it as capturing Israel's God. Because in that time, people thought whoever controlled the object of that God, whether it was the statue, the idol, or in this case, the ark, the box that was supposed to be the emblem of his presence, whoever had the object had the God. So if you had the object, you had the God. It's like a lot of people, and there's nothing wrong with this in the sense of wearing a cross, but I'm convinced that a lot of people put on crosses because they think that somehow they're covering themselves. Whoever controlled the object controlled the God, they thought. And there is not much difference in our text between Israel and Philistine. In fact, when Israel shouts and when the Philistines are afraid, when the ark comes into the camp, both of them are just being superstitious. But chapter 5, verse 1 through chapter 6, verse 12 show that while God's people can be defeated, God is never defeated. The Philistines, they take the ark, and they don't smash it to bits or throw it away or anything like that. Instead, they take it and they put it inside the temple to their god, Dagon. They would have seen it as, we've got your God, and now we're going to put it in this temple so we can have 2 gods on our side. And so they put it into the temple of their god Dagon, and then they leave, and they come back after the first night, and their statue of their god has fallen down on his face as though it's worshiping before the ark of Yahweh. And people were used to this in this day, you got to help your God out sometimes. He has bad nights, So you come in, you pick up your God, and you stand him back up. Dagon, get yourself together, let's keep it together. And they go away and they come back after the second night, but this time Dagon has fallen over and his head and his hands have both broken off. And in ancient times, when you were fighting a battle, many times you would, I know this is a little gross if you're squeamish, you would cut your opponent's head off as a trophy. You know the story of David and Goliath. What does David do at the end? He cuts Goliath's head off. You would take the head or the hands as a trophy, and that's exactly the picture of what's going on here. Dagon is defeated in his own temple before God. Interestingly, if you're interested in archaeology and those kinds of things, there is a drawing that's been found in this region of Dagon falling down, and there is a line that runs beneath his wrists and through his neck. From this early Bronze Age time that we're talking about exactly here. But this is a battle that had been going on in Judges chapter 16. If you know the story of Samson, Samson at the end of his life, what does he do? He tears down the temple to Dagon in Gaza. We were to advance forward. King Saul, when he's killed on the battlefield, the Philistines are going to take his head and they're going to hang it in the temple of Dagon. This back and forth. But God didn't need his people to come in and defeat the Philistines. God could handle it all by himself. God didn't even need a ride back home. Because the Philistines, we see in this passage that every time the ark was taken to a different city, that there was an outbreak of a disease that most people think was bubonic plague. Because they got tumors. And they understood long before Europeans understood this later on that it was related somehow to this infestation of mice that were there. And everywhere the ark went, this plague went with it. And so they kept sending it on from city to city to city, and every place they sent it, they would get this plague. So they came up with an idea. Some of the people thought, well, it's just chance. And other people thought, no, it's Yahweh. He's doing this. And so they devised this plan. Let's take these two cows that have calves. So the very natural thing, these two cows, I did not ask Eric first if this is true, but this is what I read. Their natural thing is going to want to be to take care of their calves. And so they take these two cows that have calves and they attach them to a cart, and they've never pulled a cart before, and they put the ark on the cart, and they say, if God's the one, God of Israel, if he's the one that's doing this, then he's going to make it so that these cows don't go to their calves. Instead, they're going to go to this specific Jewish border city called Beth Shemesh. They're going to go directly there. And of course, so they do. Look at verse 12, the beginning of chapter 6, verse 12. It says the cows went straight up the road. Nobody's driving them except God. Went straight up the road to Beth Shemesh. They stayed on that one highway, lowing as they went. They're being driven by something other than their nature. They never strayed to the right or to the left. There could be no doubt, because the Philistines may have defeated Israel, but they never defeated Israel's God. Now, how can I possibly say that God can never be defeated when all around us we see the waning influence of Christianity? I mean, that's not a new thing. Everybody knows that churches close, they don't open. And that the influence of Christians in our culture is not what it once was. Or how can I say that to some of you who are at a time in your life where it feels like it's just defeat after defeat? How can I say that God can never be defeated? Well, I would say true, the West is descending into all kinds of paganism and unbelief. That is true. And it's true that many so-called Christian churches and denominations have moved away from the idea that God alone is able to save. They're like the Philistines. We'll take God, but we could also take your God and put him in. We're tolerant, we're respectful. And God is judging the West. And if you don't see it, it's only because you're so close and nearsighted. But confusion and division and brokenness reign. And we as a people are trying so hard to numb ourselves in every way that we can. Prescription drugs, illicit drugs, entertainment, we're doing everything we can to numb ourselves from this truth. Back in chapter 4, verse 3, I told you they asked the right question. Why is God doing this? But they don't wait for the answer. That's a good question. Why is God against them? few years back, it was a movement. There was this group of 4 prominent atheists, and they were dubbed the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse because they were going to mock Christianity into oblivion. That was their goal. But the exact opposite has happened. One has died, and 2 of them now call themselves cultural Christians because they see what's happened by removing the influence of Christianity from the society. And this cycle is played out over and over all throughout history. And while it's true that many so-called Christian churches are dying or have died, it is mostly those who have abandoned the gospel. Because if you actually look at the data, gospel churches are growing. Young people are seeking God in ways that their parents didn't. Christianity is exploding in the global south and in the east. And I do not deny that sometimes it is discouraging for us to witness what's happening around us. And it may seem that God is defeated, but it only seems that way. It only seems that way. Because unlike Dagon, God did not need anyone to do anything for him. God doesn't need you and me. It doesn't depend on us what God is going to do. Now, God graciously desires to use us. He invites us to be involved in what he is doing, to take part in his victory. Next Sunday, you're going to be able to see some people that are going to give testimony to what God has done in their life by being baptized. Some of you are going to be there, and God used you in that person's life. God used you for that person, for God to have victory in their life so that they would come to a saving knowledge of Christ. And a number of these people, they didn't grow up in church. God had a victory in their life, and you're going to be able to look and you're going to be able to say that God was gracious enough to use you. What a joy that is. Now, I have one last point, and I need to hurry. I want to make this one quickly. I just want to say God is never familiar. God is never familiar. Now, this one is hard for us. It's hard for us because we rightly say that Christianity is not a religion. It's about a relationship with God. After all, we call God Father, and he calls us his children. Jesus calls us his brothers and his friends. So it's a relational faith. God came down in Jesus so that we could know what he is. And I want you to say, to understand that God is knowable, but God is not familiar. He's knowable, but he's not familiar. While he is Father and we are children, so too he is Lord and we are servants. And when the ark arrives in Beth Shemesh, they put it on a rock. They take it off the cart and they put it on a rock. And verse 19 of chapter 6 is a bit shocking. Kind of matter of fact for what it's saying. So look at verse 19. I want to remind you that God had been bringing plagues through all the Philistine cities. You'd expect this to be a time when the ark is back among his people. That's good times, right? But look at verse 19. It says, God struck down the people of Beth Shemesh because they looked inside the ark of the Lord. Now there's a bit of a translation thing there. It's not clear if they looked in it, like they took the top off and they looked in, or if they looked upon it. Either way, the point is the same, because they weren't even supposed to be able to see it. It was supposed to be covered. And it goes on to say the people mourned because the Lord struck them with a great slaughter. He struck down, I skipped this. He struck down 70 persons. 70 people. You see, before, the people of Israel, they thought the ark was a magic box. Now they just think it's a common curiosity. It's just there for you to look upon. They are treating God in a familiar way. When Moses encounters God on Mount Sinai, it says that he fell down and worshiped, and by the time he came down, his face was glowing so much they had to cover it up. When Isaiah has a vision of God in his glory, it says that he fell down before God and repented. When John has his vision of Christ in his glory in the book of Revelation, it says that he falls down like a dead man. Jonathan Edwards noted that it's the absence of godly fear that reveals a lack of knowledge of God. To be in the presence of God is to be moved by his glory. So when somebody, I hear athletes do this a lot. When somebody refers to God as the man upstairs, I struggle. When somebody tells you that they don't believe in God, it's a good thing when someone says they don't believe in God for you to say to them, well, tell me about the God you don't believe in, because usually the God you hear about is not the God of the Bible. And you can say, well, I don't believe in that God either. But maybe more important for us today, when we say we believe in God, we ought to ask ourselves, tell me about the God you do believe in. Because I'm afraid far too often that God doesn't look very much like the God of the Bible either. Eli's daughter-in-law named her son Ichabod because the glory had departed. May that never be true of us. May that never be true of this church. A few years ago, an American Olympian and runner, Sydney McLaughlin, she won the gold medal, and she was very bold to give the glory to God. But sure, you say, of course, it's easy to give God glory when you win the gold medal. But she went on to say this in an interview. She said, I no longer run for self-recognition, but to reflect his perfect will that is already set in stone. I don't deserve anything, but by grace through faith, Jesus has given me everything. Records come and go. The glory of God is eternal. Amen. We all want to win. We all want things to go the way we want them to go, but God is not less glorious when we lose. God is still God. As Eli said in our text last week to Samuel, he said, he is the Lord, let him do what he thinks is good. So what should we do? What should we do by the weightiness of the glory of God? We should humble ourselves before such a God. We should humble ourselves before him. Once again, they ask the right question, but they don't ponder long enough to come to the right answer. Look at chapter 6, verse 20. It says, the people of Beth Shemesh ask, who is able to stand in the presence of the Lord, this holy God? What an amazing, appropriate question to ask. The answer, of course, is no one, because we're sinners and he's glorious. No one except the one who came and lived the sinless life in our place. Only he could stand before such a God. They should have waited for the answer, but instead it just says that they did the same thing that the Philistines did, and they sent it on to a different city. And I fear that too often that happens here. God speaks to you. He's speaking to your heart. And instead of dealing with God and answering the question, you just push it down the road. Sinners must fall before him in humility and faith, and every single one of us is a sinner. The people of Beth Shemesh would rather stand outside of his glory than bow. And the glory of God departs from that city also. Let it not be true of us. And those who call Jesus Lord live, whether we live in what the world would consider victory or defeat, we live always in victory, because the purpose of our life is to live for the glory of God. And if God is glorified in what the world calls victory, gold medals, wonderful. And if God is glorified in how I handle defeat, then wonderful. In Philippians chapter 1, verses 9 through 11, Paul is praying for that church, and he says, I pray this, that your love will keep on growing in knowledge and every kind of discernment, so that you may approve the things that are superior and may be pure and blameless in the day of Christ, filled with the fruit of righteousness that comes through Jesus Christ to the glory and praise of God. Whatever God's doing in your life, that's the purpose of it. And so the Christian life is simply this. In response to the glory of God, we live to reflect that glory back to him. Now, in just a moment, we're going to receive communion. And I want to invite you, if you have believed on Jesus Christ, if you have been baptized into his body, then we invite you to participate with us. But first, we need to prepare our hearts, because I know that that is not true of every person that's here. And some of you have been confronted this morning by the glory of God. And I pray that you would take just these next couple of moments and you would deal with God. Who can stand before this holy God, they ask. And the answer is, I can't and you can't. But Jesus can, and that's why through faith in him, you can know that you have eternal life. And so if you've never taken that step, I want to invite you to do that. Would you bow your heads and close your eyes just for a moment? And it's also possible that you're here and you're a Christian and you've just lost sight of the glory of God in your life. And I want to invite you as well to deal with God about that. Rearrange right now the furniture of your life and say, God is the weightiest thing. What else needs to change? And God will show you.